In 1961, Japan's defense forces adopted the Type 61 tank. Compared with contemporary American or Soviet designs, it looked outdated almost from the moment it appeared. Yet despite its obvious shortcomings, it remained in service for decades, simply because it was exactly what the country needed at the time. Mitsubishi began work back in 1955, shortly after the self-defense forces were established. After Japan's defeat in the Second World War, the country no longer had a domestic tank industry. The entire Imperial-era fleet was scrapped. Then the Cold War began, and the Korean War broke out. Under agreements with the West, Japan rebuilt its military as the Self-Defense Forces. Early on, Japanese tankers received Shermans and Chaffees, but those could not be a long-term solution. The more powerful Pershings and Pattons looked far more convincing, yet they were deemed too heavy and too expensive. Officers liked the nimble Bulldog, but it still lacked adequate protection. So the military went looking for a golden mean. Japan wanted a compact tank in the 35-ton class armed with a 90mm gun. Korea had shown that smaller calibers were no longer effective enough, while 105mm had not yet become the global standard. Among foreign designs, the Soviet T-54 fit Japanese requirements best, but for obvious reasons, it was impossible to obtain. The tank would have to be built domestically, even if it drew on American experience. Early prototypes resembled the M47, an elongated hull, a forward-set turret, and a bulky engine compartment. But there was a key difference. Japanese engineers placed the transmission in the front of the hull, as on many Second World War-era tanks. That simplified maintenance, but consumed valuable space up front. The first prototypes still had the angular lines of wartime vehicles, yet subsequent versions adopted a progressively more modern look. The armor protection was relatively weak. It was hard to justify even with a first-shot philosophy. The engine lagged behind American counterparts, and the gun no longer seemed especially powerful. But those drawbacks were offset by the tank's compact dimensions. Its height and width allowed it to be moved over Japan's narrow roads and bridges. Mitsubishi experimented with an autoloader on the third prototype, but the cost was too high, and it remained a dead end. In other respects, however, the work was carried through and the design was readied for production. The Type 61 entered series production in 1962 and became a solid first step for Japan's engineers. With the self-defense forces as the only customer, Mitsubishi kept its ambitions realistic. By focusing on local terrain and the tank's expected missions, the company produced a vehicle suited to ambushes and defensive fighting. The Type 61 stayed in service for many years and went through several upgrades. For example, some vehicles received infrared searchlights, but the chassis was already near its limit. There was little room left to increase firepower or protection. The next step for Japanese tank design was the Type 74, but that's a story for another time.